back down to the feature match area now for a little bit more of that mono black goodness. Hello and welcome to this round 11 of Grand Prix Birmingham. I'm Tim Willoughby here with Simon Gertzen, and we know how much you enjoyed watching Mario Rodriguez Lopez playing his mono black list in the last round. So we got a little bit more of it against Martin User. Martin User on red black mid-range, not blue black that you see there on the screen there. And actually the red kind of the most important bit of it. The black, if we were scaling it in terms of what's most important, to be a big red R, a tiny little black there, scrap heap, scrounge out, unlicensed disintegration, and so on, the key black cards on the right-hand side of our table. Meanwhile, for Mario Rodriguez Lopez here, it's all black all the time. A little bit of Khan in there just for a little bit of salt with all that pepper, but you know what? This deck is very much about getting to the mid-game, getting to the late game, and once it has a lot of mana, which it can generate in a number of different ways, it can create some absolutely bonkers turns of Magic, Simon.
Yeah, and you really feel the impact of Goblin Chain Whirler and Dreadshade to this constructed format. Suddenly, everybody's playing monocolored decks or monocolored decks with a splash.
Yeah, and as it stands, the black deck, it's actually going a lot bigger than even a triple black card.
This version doesn't play it, but it's still. Somehow the printing of these cards in Dominaria has led people down this path.
Yeah, and I must admit, I kind of like it. To me, this is one of the more subtle harkening back to older decks from older formats that kind of appeals to me here. Early doors, we just got Goblin Chain Whirler and that Heart of Kieran coming from Martin User. Mario taking some early hits, but you can bet that if he's playing a black deck, he has got a happy amount of removal that he will be deploying at some point comparatively soon here. Each of these players at 9-1. Martin User, he had a bit of a rough time of it when it came to the Legacy, but when I asked him about how his day was going on day one of our Legacy GP here, so that being Friday, he said, well, you know what, maybe this is the beginning of a great story of me winning a standard GP. And thus far, he's doing all right with it. He's casting a Glory Bringer here, getting some big hits in. Surely we're going to see a little bit of activity here. Fatal Push on Heart of Kieran to stem the bleeding a little bit, but Mario taking early damage here. He's going to have to do some work to get back in this game in the early stages. We know that he must have removal sooner or later. It's just a matter of when he's going to start deploying it.
He actually drew a Vraska's Contempt here, so that's an important card to stem the bleeding.
Cabal Stronghold, the newer version of Cabal Coffers, still very powerful indeed. Takes a little bit longer for it to come online and start being a net generator of mana. 3 mana plus the tapping of itself to add 1 for each basic swamp you control. And Battle at the Bridge here is the option being gone for by Mario Rodriguez Lopez here, dealing with that Glory Bringer quite nicely.
And Cabal Stronghold is currently at the breaking point. So break even point, you spend 4 of your lands to get 4 mana back. But every additional swamp means that it will generate more and more mana.
Big Walking Ballista coming along for Martin User. He doesn't mind having lots of lands in play either if he gets to cast his construct as a slightly larger creature. He will be able to throw some damage around at some point, even if there is removal pointed at it. And Battle at the Bridge, a lovely piece of removal that does gain you life in the casting, but something like Walking Ballista, you can just throw those tokens away before it gets to resolve, negate the life gain there.
If you can build an aggressive deck that is not unhappy drawing many lands, that's usually a very good place to be, and it looks like Martin has managed exactly that.
Tetsamok Primal Death there, marking out that Walking Ballista as potentially not being long for this world. You get to potentially activate it multiple times a turn, which is what we saw last round, and there's Vraska's Contempt for Goblin Chain Whirler. Mario Rodriguez Lopez doing a great job of dealing with these creatures. Now he's hitting that slightly larger mana threshold.
No, he's stabilizing above 10 here. Martin, we can't see his hand right now, but he's running out of steam slowly but surely. His cards have been really high impact, but they haven't generated any card advantage. There's almost no card draw available to black-red, so it's really all about getting those heavy hitters onto the battlefield, and maybe a little bit of the more value-oriented cards like Rekindling Phoenix or Scrappy Scrounger.
So an Abrade in response there, simply to negate the life gain from Mario Rodriguez Lopez. I guess that Martin User, recognizing he's not necessarily going to have too many targets for that Abrade, he would rather make sure that Mario's life total goes in the correct direction, which for the red decks, looking from the other side of the table, is definitely down.
Yeah, this was basically a shock to the face, this Abrade, which is, well, not great, but sometimes you have to do what you have to do. It also put the Chain Roller in the graveyard, which might be relevant at some point, thinking about Scrap Heap Scrounger, but it's not very likely.
So now the activation of this Cabal Stronghold generating 5 mana off just 4 lands.
So we are at +1, basically.
Spending 4 of it, using a die just to keep track of the amount of mana floating here. Khan's Scion of Urza. Now, in some lists, this will be principally a way of generating constructs. Not so for the mono-black control list, where a lot of the time you'll see that initial +1. So here we've got the top 2 cards being revealed. Martin will choose which of those cards is going to go into Mario's hand. The other one will be exiled with a silver counter on it for Khan to potentially draw in the future. No great surprises there that he elects to just give another copy of Khan. And here we have Never. I kind of like the interplay that happens with Tetzamok, that you can put that hunt counter on and then kill it with some other spell, and you've almost disguised the fact that you've got other removal by revealing Tetzamok there. Mm-hmm.
It's also difficult to play around, because if you then play out more creatures, then Tetzamok will wrath your board, and if you don't, then you run into exactly this problem of a removal spell clearing your whole board. Now Martin doesn't have any attackers. Glorybringer would be great, although not lethal at this point.
Yeah, Mario on 5 life definitely has cause for concern. There are draws from Martin User that can find that extra reach to close out games. But Mario Rodriguez Lopez, he has successfully made it to the mid to late game, and that not necessarily a trivial task against these red decks. They can be very aggressive. I like a Walking Ballista here, threatening plenty more damage on Mario that's going to be difficult for him to stop.
Yeah, that's actually a great card to have for Martin, and he's holding Chandra. So he might be able to deal 5 points of damage without letting Mario gain life with Vraska's Contempt that he's holding.
Yeah, the Vraska's Contempt, normally a pretty safe bet for 2 life, but the exact lineup of creatures being drawn by Martin User, enough to deal with things. Worth noting that the way that we analyze the life totals on both sides, quite different based on these 2 decks. The red deck, it's pretty straightforward, looking to knock Mario from 20 to 0. So having done 15 points of damage, it's doing fairly well. The fact that Martin User still on 20 life, not a massive concern for the mono-black deck. Once it starts dealing damage, it can deal quite a bit of damage, torrents of hailfires, etc. And so for Mario here, I don't think that he's necessarily worried about the fact that he's not dealt damage yet. He might just be a little bit more concerned that he's left himself within striking distance of death here.
Yeah, that's actually his only concern at this point.
All right, so here we saw the -1 ability of Khan there in order to pick up Doomfall.
Floating 2 mana.
So Mario now at just 2 life. And it may be that all of this work that he's aimed at thus far for naught if there is that Chandra off the top.
Does he play Vraska's Contempt on his own card? No.
Goes for Gonti, Lord of Luxury.
Understandably.
I mean, yeah, it's definitely not a play that you will make trivially, killing your own Planeswalker simply for 2 life when you don't know what your opponent has going on.
No, maybe if his mana works out differently, in the sense that he can pass with 4 mana up, then he plays it differently because he wants to play around Glorybringer, and that way he would also play around Chandra.
Yeah, because he wasn't able to have enough swamps in play to use his Cabal Stronghold without leaving enough lands up, kind of forced into that line of action a little bit. And for Martin User here, the shields are down on the other side of things. This Chandra ought to be enough.
Take 2.
All right, on to game 2. Gonzi, yes, he got to borrow a card off the top of Martin User's deck, but that card will be going back now, and each of these players reaching to their sideboard, seeing what they can do in this matchup. Now, the fact that Mario Rodriguez Lopez went to 8-0 on day 1, just picked up a single loss at the start of today, suggests to me that he probably has a pretty good game against red decks, because we know that there have been a lot of them in the room of varying varieties over the course of this weekend. Martin User on this red blacklist, not the only one to be playing almost exactly the 75. Petr Sahurek travelled with him and is on a very similar looking list, also at X&1.
Mm-hmm. That's quite impressive. I mean, these are also 2 of the most experienced players in the room, but it shows that this deck has what it takes to be competitive in Standard.
So small spot adjustments being made here, and it's really interesting to me, cards like Battle at the Bridge. We saw one of them in the main deck for Mario Rodriguez Lopez. I think that he might have the option of bringing in another one here. It's not a quick card, but the fact that it's a removal spell that also grants him a little bit of life gain may make it a tempting one in this sort of a matchup.
I'm interested to see how this will play out after sideboarding. I think Martin's general strategy stays the same. He just has to play the most heavy hitters that he can find. He can take out a lot of the removal spells that he has in the main deck, and then there will be an anti-control package in his sideboard. Basically, when you build these kind of mid-range decks, and this is certainly one, you have one part of your sideboard dedicated to beating aggro decks, where you take out some of the more expensive cards and bring in more removal. And then the other half is dedicated to beating control decks, so that you can take out those Magma Sprays, those Abrades, and bring in Duresses, Doomfalls, Argrel's Bloodfast, so that you can almost go head-to-head with them. Not quite, but you're also playing a longer game.
I guess that's one of the small advantages of being a little bit more mid-rangey in your list, is that you have the option of both pressing down on the accelerator or maybe pumping the brakes a little bit to be able to match up better with what's going on. If your main deck configuration is as fast as it can possibly be, then your room for adjustment isn't quite so large.
Yeah, and you're also getting punished more if things don't go your way. If you're playing control and you are just too slow, there's nothing you can do about it. If you're playing aggro and you're not fast enough, well, you're most likely going to lose. With a mid-range deck that Martin User is playing, you have the danger of drawing the wrong half of your deck, depending on the matchup, but depending on your draw and what the opponent is doing, you can also always put yourself in a position of hope. Of course, that doesn't always work out. You will lose to aggro, you will lose to control sometimes, but there's almost no matchup where you just roll over and die in game 1.
Yeah, living in magical Lloyd Christmas land where there's always a chance.
Yeah, and there is a price to be paid for being in the center of the spectrum, but at the same time you get this flexibility that the other archetypes don't have.
All right, well, these players just shuffling up for their game 2 here. Mario Rodriguez Lopez on the mono black control list, Martin User with black red vehicles, and Mario's going to have to win 2 games on the bounce if he's going to get through to 10-1 record here in this round. And even if he considered his matchup against red pretty good, winning 2 in a row a little bit trickier.
Yes, I completely agree. Winning one on the play would also mean winning the other one on the draw. Now, Martin is not super aggressive here, but he has enough disruption and enough hard-hitting creatures that you can be on the back foot really quickly, which makes especially Karn Sign of Urza so much weaker.
And things like damage from Spire of Industry for Martin User, he's not going to mind too much about that, simply because if it means that his mana's stable, it's not as if his life total is being attacked, particularly early doors at least, from Lopez on the other side of the table.
Yeah, that's not really a concern here. Only if he wants to draw the maximum amount of cards with Argyll's Bloodfast, maybe.
Yeah, Argyll's Bloodfast, an interesting one. A card that maybe not so much of a main deck inclusion, but if we're talking about ways of adjusting the overall acceleration potential of your deck, it slows you down a little bit in terms of board development, but drastically improves what you can do in terms of getting cards in hand and potentially having big turns.
Yes, and for me the key question here is, how does Martin actually sideboard? We have in his main deck 3 Abrades, 3 Magma Sprays, and 4 Unlicensed Disintegration. So Abrade has actually a few targets in Mario's deck. The Walking Ballista is an artifact, Azur's Gateway is an artifact, but these are not the main cards you're really concerned about. So
Martin's just taking a step away from the table here. We're not quite sure whether or not that's him checking something with a judge or just going to a restroom, having a quick moment to freshen up before this game too. Already a game up, 35 minutes left on the round, plenty of time for him to close this game out. Even if it goes to 3, realistically, I think there's a good chance that we'll be able to get through this in regulation time. Meanwhile, Mario Rodriguez-Lopez, he's just going to have to sit there and think about what he needs to do in these next 2 games as Martin is away from the table. Psychologically, it's one of those things that for some people, that moment to recenter will be a blessing that's arrived from nowhere. But if Mario in any way is, I don't know, stewing about how that first game went, feels like maybe there's something he could have done differently, then it's just time that he has to extra think about that when he should really just be remaining calm and thinking about his match. Looks like Mario comparatively composed here, a little smile on User's face as he shuffles up ready to go into this game too. Every reason to feel happy for him, of course, because he did pick up that first game win. Probably a little bit of concern in the middle there, as it looked like Mario was getting in control, but the early damage that he'd been able to achieve just about enough to squeeze out the win. Because ultimately it was Exactsi's 3 points off Walking Ballista, 2 points off Chandra that did it. If there'd been even 1 more point of life for Mario, then that could have been quite a different game 1.
Yeah, at least from Mario's perspective. From Martin's perspective, he was even holding another Glory Bringer. So from Martin's side, that didn't really look like a close game.
All right, off to the races in game 2 here. No big surprise to see lots of swamps coming from Rodriguez-Lopez. Duress here, early doors. He actually waited a turn, I think, on that Duress. Is there a good reason for not casting it on turn 1 there, Simon?
Well, you give your opponent a few more chances of drawing into a Planeswalker, for example, that you might want to take. You still do it before Heart of Kiran can come down, so because that's one of the scarier cards. Even though being mono black, you have access to Fatal Push, meaning you can deal with Heart of Kiran much better than, for example, blue-white control.
So Rodriguez didn't actually have very many options in terms of what to take there, though. Very happy to hit a Heart of Kiran. Turn 2 sees a 1/1 Walking Ballista coming from Martin User. Walking Ballista was the agent of his demise in game 1, but here getting hit by a Fatal Push pretty early. Obviously a parting shot there for the single point from Martin User. And Walking Ballista on the other side of things available for Mario Lopez, and crucially it looks like he might be missing a third land here. One thing about this mono black control deck is that it really needs quite a few lands in play before it can get in gear, and Goblin Chainwhirler punishing the 1/1 on the other side of the battlefield.
And he knew about the Chainwhirler, right? He saw it when he duressed.
Yeah, all told, it may be that it is that Mario is a little rattled about what happened in game 1 here. Plays another duress on User. There's not going to be that much more that he's going to be able to see here. But in the absence of anything else, he did know about Unlicensed Disintegration. So that is one more card dealt with preemptively. But with Goblin Chainwhirler on the battlefield, 3-point swings. We saw it yesterday with Delvero's Secrets getting transformed. 3-point swings do not take very long to add up.
Yeah, and now Martin is, of course, very far ahead here. He adds more to the board. This means a card like Bontu's Last Reckoning would 2-for-1 him, but it would also take effectively 2 turns of Mario, who is already mana screwed. So I think that's definitely right here to try to put on as much pressure as possible.
So Cabal Stronghold as the third land. It's just going to be tapping for colorless mana for the time being because it's going to take a lot more swamps before it really gets going. And Mario here looking at a hand that is not too exciting in the face of 2 Goblin Chainwhirlers. They're going to be attacking for 6 each and every turn.
I don't know how he sideboarded, but his hand looks super clunky. I don't like this glut of 4-drops that we see here. Joseph Vesp has good stats, but for Martin it's actually not so difficult to deal with a 4-5.
All right, what do we have here? It is a Doomfall, so that will deal with one of the Goblin Chainwhirlers, halving the clock that Martin User is presenting here. But here comes Glorybringer, doing exactly what Glorybringer has been doing in Standard for as long as Standard has allowed it, which is flying in with haste, dealing a bit of damage. No need to kill a creature here, no need to exert. So right now, 7 damage being threatened by Martin User. Mario Rodenas Lopez in check. He has to find a way of dealing with at least one of the creatures on the other side of the battlefield. Otherwise, it's all over.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Already facing lethal here. Of course, Goblin Chainwhirler, there should be a way to at least threaten a block. Whoa.
Nothing. It's just a handshake there from Mario Rodenas Lopez. And that means that we have already got a match win for Martin User, advancing to 10-1. He picked up a single loss yesterday, but he has had a perfect start to day 2, and the same cannot be said of Mario Rodenas Lopez. He has had a little bit of a rough one. He picked up his first loss earlier in the day, and 3 rounds into Grand Prix Birmingham day 2, he's already got 2 losses. Got to be a rough old feeling for him as he starts off his Sunday here.
Yeah, but that's what happens. You have to keep calm. You have to keep going. Maybe, I don't know if it was the feature match, the name of his opponent, but it looked like he wasn't quite in the game.
Yeah, a little rattled, a couple of little missteps maybe there that didn't quite work out for him. But, I mean, that's part of the potency of the red deck, is that if there is a little stumble, the red decks can pounce like no other deck in almost any scenario you could envision. But that is the end of our live magic here. We will have a little bit more for you soon, but first, these messages. Hello and welcome back to coverage of Grand Prix Birmingham. I'm Tim Willoughby. This is Pro Tour winner Simon Gertsen. And after our main match is complete, that does not mean to say that there's not more magic going on in the feature match area. We're actually going to jump across and join some of our matches in progress in our feature match area and see a little bit more of what we've got going on over there. So here we have Adrian Ramiro Cano and up against a player whose name is probably the name I have the most trouble pronouncing of any name in Magic, weirdly, Simon. But as his countryman, I was wondering if you can help me out on this one.
Yeah, it's Sascha Schwarz.
It's some combination of the zh sounds that always gets me a little bit wound up. But we have blue-black mid-range on one side of things here, Champion of Wits in play with a couple of zombies for Cano, and Schwarz on the other side of things. He is on Grixis Chainwhirler, so 3 colours, but still able to cast Goblin Chainwhirler. No mean feat there.
Yeah, talk about greedy, right? A triple red card in a Grixis colored deck.
And the Scorpion God in play here, allowing Ravenous Chupacabra to have come back from the dead, still hungry. And Whirler Virtuoso. It's been a little while since I've seen that one doing the rounds in Standard, but still powering out Thopters just as always.
Yeah, and Schwarz has a lot of Thopters in play already. It looks like things have been going his way. Of course, he also is the player with the Scarab God in play. That Ravenous Chupacabra, half out of its sleeve, that probably means it has been internalized by the Scarab God.
A 4/4 zombie Chupacabra. The life totals 4-8 in Schwarz's favor, and that looks like it's going to be enough. Glorybringer, it's been doing good work in our feature match area here. It's one of those things that there are some cards that are very synergy based, right? That you, in order for them to really shine, you need to draw them in combination with appropriate other cards.
And then there are other cards which are just 5 mana haste dragons.
That kill your opponent's creatures and indeed your opponents as necessary. Glorybringer, the only help that it needs is 3 colorless mana and 2 red mana, and then you're pretty much golden.
It combos with 5 lands.
Yeah, very neatly indeed. Occasionally, I'm sure somewhere in the room there'll be someone that's casting it with 4 lands and, I don't know, a Servant of the Conduit, Landwire Elves maybe. But casting it on turn 5, certainly not embarrassing. The fact that it's able to kill creatures as soon as it comes into play, so that it's at card parity very quickly indeed, or indeed able to attack for 4 before your opponent's been able to untap, means that it's really difficult to get punished for tapping out those 5 mana. There are some 5 drops that if you cast it and then your opponent answers it with a 2-3 mana removal spell, you kind of feel like you're on the wrong side of things. Difficult for you to be in that spot with Glorybringer.
I'm checking out Sascha's mana base here, and he is playing a ton of non-basic lands to make Grixis Chainwhirler a reality. Of course, not too many lands that don't produce red, otherwise the whole thing wouldn't work. 4 Ether Hubs, probably an important part. It's almost a little bit like Grixis Energy or Sultai Energy builds that we've seen in the past before the rotation. Of course, still a really powerful 1-2 punch. You start with Glintsleeve Siphoner, you follow up with a Whirler Virtuoso, and Ether Hub is fixing your mana on the way.
Now, on the other side of things, I'm having a look at Adrian Ramiro Cano's list, and we refer to it as blue-black mid-range for a very specific reason, that when you look through this list, when you think about blue-black, one of the things that might immediately spring to mind is the presence of assorted pieces of counter magic. There's access to Syncopate and so on and so forth that you might reasonably expect to see in a blue-black list. At least in the main deck for Adrian, that is not the path that he's choosing to walk. He has lots of creatures in there, and then the ways of interacting that he has above and beyond the likes of Ravenous Chupacabra and so on, that's a creature that interacts, are either planeswalkers or creature removal spells. He's not all about countering spells before they resolve, at least in his main deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how you can classify standard decks at the moment by wanting to play certain cards, wanting to exploit certain powerful rares and mythics. And I think the blue-black deck is just the Scarab God, right? It's built around making the most out of the Scarab God. Of course, I see a few Karns, I see 2 Lilianas, but in the end, if you don't resolve a Scarab God in your game, you're not really happy with how things are going.
And as we saw there, it was Schwarz that was on the correct side of the Scarab God. and that might have been part of the reason that he was ultimately able to have emerged victorious in that game 1. These players just going into the game 2 here. This is live Magic, so anything could happen in the next half hour. Just shuffling up here, and Adrian Ramiro-Cano, as much as I said that he doesn't have counter magic in the main, there is a small amount of counter magic in the sideboard there. He's got negates to work with, which are almost ubiquitous. If you've got blue mana, then chances are you want to have at least 1 or 2 negates in the sideboard. I would guess that the same is true of Schwarz on the other side of things, that he has that option available to him. Whether or not he'll choose to deploy it here, I'm not quite sure.
No, absolutely. We will actually see quite similar sideboarding. Doomfalls, Duresses, Negates, maybe Jace's Defeat. It's kind of funny. It's almost like a mirror match, a blue-black mirror, except that Sasha is splashing for Goblin Chainwhirler.
Now, one of the cards that I think is kind of interesting in the sideboard for Ramiro-Cano, a card that I was talking to Matt Folks about before Standard even kicked off this weekend, is the Eldest Reborn, one of the sagas from Dominaria. And this is one of those cards that, given appropriate time, actually represents quite a lot of advantage from a single mana investment.
Let's see, you get a creature or a planeswalker, you get a card, and then you get a reanimate. So that's at least 3 cards. It's probably more when you consider the impact that this card has.
And the only real investment is not so much, I mean, obviously the mana is important, you can't cast it for nothing. If you could, it would be one of the best cards ever printed. But the 5 mana that you're spending on it, if anything, it's more about the time it takes to do those things. If it were simply doing all 3 of those things immediately for 5 mana, we would be seeing it played in main decks all over the place. 5 mana and 3 turns to get everything going on it, that is a little bit more of a challenge, and there are matchups where you simply don't have that sort of time. But as things get slower, as things get more mid-rangey, control-y, grindy, this is the sort of card that can pull you a little bit ahead.
Very, very important and very correct observation. In Magic, the developers, maybe more than the designers, have the ability to balance cards not only by their mana cost, but also by their impact over time. Now, designing these cards is not as easy as, like, let's say, a shock or a creature with summoning sickness, but the sagas actually do a really nice job emulating Suspend, the old time spiral mechanic in a certain sense.
And I like the fact that even though in principle you could have had some sagas, maybe the Sarpadian Empires, that had 53 chapters and took a very long time to reach that final payoff, they said, you know what, let's keep things simple. Everything has 3 elements to it. And in some cases, History of Benalia, for example, you may find that some of those different phases are very, very similar. In the instance of the Eldest Reborn, they're different in each stage of the process.
Oh, this is just a good, clean design. I think the number 3, very well chosen.
The magic number, some might say.
For a lot of design topics, certainly.
Yes.
Now, how susceptible is Ramiro's blue-black deck against Goblin Chainwhirler?
Well, he has Glintsteel Siphoner in there. Obviously, we've seen a surprising number of 1/1 Walking Ballistas thus far, in our tournament at least. But by and large, I mean, Champion of Wits, yes, it's a smaller creature. It's going to come back at some point, though. I don't feel like he has as much to fear from a Chainwhirler as some of the other lists that we've seen thus far. There are obviously moments where there, as we have seen in previous rounds, will be attacks from the red deck that you have to be a little bit careful about how you block, based on the understanding there could be that extra point of damage post-combat. But I don't think that Adrian necessarily has as much to fear as some lists, though worth noting that he does have Planeswalkers as well, and those Planeswalkers will get hit by the Chainwhirler just as much as creatures will.
Yeah, so my read is that it is... The Chainwhirler is significantly weaker in this matchup than in others, but because it's still such an effective card, and even if you draw it late, it has the chance to kill something relevant or take an important loyalty counter off something that Sasha should still just keep all of them in for exactly that reason.
All right, kicking things off now. There was a mulligan from Adrian, and he will have to start on 6 here. But with just a cycling land being played by Schwarz on the first turn, he's not going to be at least facing down too early a threat. And this Grixis list, it's not so much about turn 1 threats as it might be slightly later. So we see A hand revealed off duress here. Just a Vraska's Contempt that can be taken with that duress, but Glorybringer, Whirler Virtuoso, Goblin Chain Whirler, appropriate mana to be able to cast everything but the Glorybringer already in hand. This is a pretty solid start for Sasha.
This is an amazing hand. His mana is effectively perfect. He can deploy the Chain Whirler on 3, but doesn't have to. He has other plays as well. So depending on what he draws, he can save that as a pseudo removal spell for, let's say, Glintstream Siphoner. But it feels like Adrian is already on the back foot, and I have to say I don't know how Sasha got this deck, if he found it or if he built it himself. I'll have to talk to him after this round, but I'm already impressed with what it's like, how it's positioning itself in the metagame.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't feel like it's a natural step to look at a card that costs red, red, red and think about a 3-color deck. So it feels to me like it will have been an iterative process to some extent to get to something like this. But it seems to be working for him so far. 9-1 on the tournament thus far as he casts a Whirler Virtuoso, generating 3 energy early doors in this game too.
And Sasha is a well-known German Grand Prix grinder. I think the description really fits. I don't think he ever skips a European GP. And it's certainly nice to see him bring something unexpected to the table.
A few interesting cards in Ramiro Cano's hand here. Ultimately going for a 2-2 Walking Ballista here, but he does have Arguel's Bloodfast in hand alongside Aethersphere Harvester. So the potential to move his life total in all sorts of directions there, between the lifelink on the Harvester and, of course, the activatability on Arguel's Bloodfast. This does seem like the sort of matchup where the Bloodfast will have time to kick in, time to draw you a happy amount of cards. My slight concern, I guess, is we know that there's the likes of Glorybringer and so on coming, and I don't see yet how Kano is going to be able to deal with that.
A lot of it comes down to the fact that ultimately when you look at these lists, Sasha is just packing power. Every one of his creatures is such a threat. And then you add 3 Chandras to the mix and 4 Vraska's Contempt and all the sideboard cards. When I look at Ramiro's deck, I see there's Champion of Wits, I see Gifted Aetherborns, I see even something like Ravenous Chupacabra as, yes, it's an answer, but it's not something to get excited about. Even Fatal Push is not at its best in this matchup.
Yeah, every card in Schwarz's deck seems like it demands some sort of response, and indeed represents a response to various things that people can have going on. Goblin Chain Whirler and that Glorybringer, they work as removal in addition to being efficient creatures. Whirler Virtuoso bringing along a friend and potentially more, maybe even helping out mana with Ether Hub. The way that these cards all stack up, there's virtual card advantage there in everything that Sasha Schwarz is doing.
I think this is actually a nightmare. You're trying to play on the same grounds, but you at the same time you can't punish the greed. You can't punish Sasha for having this crazy 3-colored mana base because you're not an aggressive deck. So ultimately you just have to accept that you're playing the weaker version of a very similar idea.
So Glorybringer comes along here with the Exert, that forcing this Walking Ballista to do a whole bunch of activity here. First off, crewing Aethersphere Harvester, and then we're going to see a shot on Glorybringer and a shot at Sasha Schwarz here. This means that the block at least will be an effective one.
That's a good exchange for Adrian, right? But, I mean, Sasha is probably hoping that he can put Adrian on 0 creatures so that this Harvester is actually not relevant anymore. And if he's holding a few removal spells, then it's actually correct to pressure Adrian's life total in particular, and hoping that this Harvester will just not be too relevant.
And I guess pressuring the life total is another way of making sure that you can minimize the impact of Arguel's Bloodfast. At some point, the pain from it does tick up. But Glintsleeve Siphoner coming down, that's another creature that will be able to crew Aethersphere Harvester. Plenty of energy knocking around here. And Schwarz, it was looking great for him in the early stages of this game, but now that Glorybringer in the graveyard, it may be that Adrian Ramiro-Cano has bought himself a graceful reprieve here, at least for a moment or two. We'll see what the follow-up is going to be. Another Chain Whirler. This forcing the crewing of that Ethersphere Harvester a little sooner.
So now the Harvester, which is a 3/5, takes 1 damage, but that's probably not enough to allow Sasha to attack.
Yeah, even with the first strike of Goblin Chain Whirler, that only totals up to 4. And 5 toughness, it's a lot against these decks.
Yeah, I mean, but now in a Braid or something like that would also be backbreaking. But I don't expect Sasha to have too many removal spells after sideboarding. So actually this Harvester is doing a great job of stopping these otherwise really scary creatures. Maybe it's time for Harvester to shine in a metagame full of Chain Whirlers. It seems like it has the perfect stats.
Yeah, the numbers stack up ideally. I mean, even 4 toughness in a Chain Whirler metagame feels a little dicey, but 5 toughness, a pretty solid blocker for Chain Whirlers. It's not going to die to the extra point all too terribly often.
No creatures on Adrian's side now, so Sasha has actually succeeded. His trade of Glorybringer against a single 2/2 Walking Ballista didn't look great, but if it allows him to attack for 9 points of damage here, then it has certainly worked out nicely.
I think we may be seeing a Vraska's Contempt coming from the other side of the table here. And there's the negate. We weren't sure exactly how many of these would be deployed after sideboarding, but definitely a big piece of removal to counter there. Protecting that Goblin Chain Whirler, representing effectively a 5-point life swing by stopping that piece of counter magic.
Hyper-aggressive use of the negate here, but we have to understand that every life point matters here, and if Adrian resolves Vraska's Contempt, that's effectively 5 more life. That's 2 more Bloodfast activations, so you don't want your opponent to draw into an out.
So Adrian Ramiro-Cano here with the Aguel's Bloodfast trigger on the stack, activates it 1 more time before it transforms into Temple of Aklazotz. Liliana in hand for him now. Death's Majesty.
Yeah, now that Sasha has used his negate, he needs to show us what he plans to do when something like a Liliana comes down. Does he have another negate? Does he have a Glorybringer so he's guaranteed to attack for lethal? Or is Adrian maybe able to stabilize because Sasha used his negate so aggressively?
All right, 5 mana. Here does come Liliana. And he's immediately looking through his graveyard to see if there are any nice targets to turn into zombies here. All right, so we now have a creature to crew that Ethersphere Harvester, but Harness Lightning at the end of turn could be enough to close things out here for Sasha Schwarz. He's already a game up. 2 mana left available for Adrian Ramiro-Cano. He does have that Temple active.
And a Glorybringer. Yeah, that was not a close game.
All right, Schwarz taking it down 2-0 for Grixis Chain Whirler. A very interesting build there, and certainly one that I'll be interested to hear more from Sasha about soon enough. Lovely stuff from him. And, you know, on the other side of things, interested to see the likes of a blue-black mid-range deck trying its hand. Clearly done all right making it into the feature match area on the record that it was, but we're going to get a chance to see still more live magic for you here from Grand Prix Birmingham. Let's head back down to our feature match area and see what we have going on between Vessel Groot and Elliot Bousseau. Skirk Prospector in play alongside a Walking Ballista. I'm very intrigued as to what's going on with this blue-red gift deck. Skirk Prospector seems like a nice creature to have around when you're trying to accelerate out Godfarer's Grift and then have creatures in the graveyard to bring back. We've seen Still Leaf Stompy from Elliot Bousseau able to do good work getting up to making gigantic monsters. It may be that he's able to close this one out too, but blue-red gift with Skirk Prospector, colour me intrigued, Simon Gertzen.
Yeah, this feels a little bit like one of these pre-constructed decks. It's somehow green fatties, green Stompy against some tricky blue-red deck where you don't quite figure out what it's trying to do. But at some point you just lose to some obscure combo. No, in this case it's actually just what we know, what we've seen before. Blue-white gifts used to play the Gate to the Afterlife and Godfarer's Gift. And this is now a blue-red version, which is a bit more, it feels a bit more all-in because of course, of Skirk Prospector and going for a more aggressive approach.
As things stand, if you want to talk all-in, I would rather be on Elliot Bousseau's side of things as he swings with a whole host of creatures here. That is a lot of damage coming across.
Also at 9-1, both of these players, very impressive records.
There's a lot of things to like about the blue-red gift deck. Even before you talk about additions from Dominaria, I was always a big fan of the way that Combat Celebrant works in that particular list. And the Warkite Marauders also have a lot of impact on many boards in terms of either the first time round being a decent attacker and the second time round being a gigantic monster with a relevant ability.
Yeah, the real question is, of course, is this in the end good enough? We saw previously in previous formats that you had to, when the Godfarer's Gift landed, you really had to reanimate something super powerful to make up for the loss of tempo. And as we see here, Vessel is under immense pressure from this green deck.
Yeah, Vessel likely going to have to throw most of his creatures under the bus here just to stay alive on this attack step.
Also, this Brontodon, of course, one of the many ways that players can destroy artifacts. Sometimes even in the main deck, we see a lot of artifact removal, which is a reason why I don't love Godfarer's Gift at the moment.
I think that Vizier in many faces may have been copying a Brontodon, hence able to deal with that Heart of Kiran, but ultimately all for naught as Elliot Bousseau able to win another match on camera with his Steel Leaf Stompy deck. Sometimes casting Lamorels on turn 1, Steel Leaf Champion on turn 2 will be good enough. Working for Elliot Bousseau thus far. We'll see how far it takes him over the course of the next few rounds. That is the end of our round here from Grand Prix Birmingham. Riley and Raph will be back very soon to bring you even more standard, but first, these messages.